welcome to the first episode of a podcast about murder. Before we get into our first story, a quick note about the podcast. I wanted to do this kind of thing for a while now. I've been a big true crime fan much of my life, big true crime podcast fan for the last couple of years. I know the market for these things is pretty oversaturated, but I wanted to give it a go anyway. I've been picking up bits and pieces about how I want the format to go, and we're just going to see how it goes. So things might be a bit up in the air, but we're just going to go with it. My co-host is going to be my good friend Jem. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Jem doesn't know what case we're going to be discussing today, so let's find out if she knows anything about it already. I wanted to cover this case as it's one I've been really intrigued by for a long time. Maybe the biggest reason for that is that the killer's first home, where he began his serial killing career, is no more than a few streets away from where I sit right now. I just passed by it the other day. Actually, I ran past it yesterday, not out of fear.
Do you just constantly run past this location?
No, I run, and so like for exercise, not from terror. I ran past the house because I was really intrigued to see it from the outside. That's why I decided to title this episode 195 Melrose Avenue. Dennis Nilsen is the name of the serial killer who lived at this address. He's also known as the Muswell Hill murderer, after the area he lived in later on, and the kindly killer. Okay. He's known to have 12 confirmed murders of men and boys. He's confessed to 3 more, but these were never validated. Have you ever heard anything about Dennis Nilsen, or...?
I don't think so. I think you might have told me about this before, but we're not actually going into the details.
We're going back to the 23rd of November 1945. Dennis Nilsen is born in a coastal town called Fraserburgh in Scotland. He was the second child born to Betty White and a Norwegian soldier called Olav Magnus Nilsen. Cool name.
Yeah.
He left Norway when the Germans invaded in 1940. Interestingly, even though Betty White and Olav Nilsen married, they never moved in together. Betty lived with her parents, where she raised the children, and she did talk about regretting this marriage quite a lot, and she would say that to Dennis and to the children, which...
That's not great. I mean...
It's not a great start.
Not great parenting.
So apparently Olav never visited his children at all, and a few years later the marriage was over. So a weird, unsuccessful situation to be born into. Not a great start.
No, not a great start for any child in that sort of unhappy marriage.
Dennis spent a lot of time with his grandparents. His mother's parents, of course, because they all lived together. They were described as hardy, religious fisherfolk.
Okay.
Something of note is that it's said that the fishing families in this area of villages were inbred, possibly for centuries, because of the isolation of the communities. It was said that Dennis Nilsen's mother's family had a lot of mental health problems and some instances of suicide, and some people blame this on the local inbreeding.
Right.
Dennis's childhood was... Do you say Dennis's or Dennis? Dennis' childhood or Dennis's childhood?
I would say Dennis's, but now that I'm saying it, it sounds weird.
It does. When I was reading it, I didn't think that. Dennis's childhood was lonely. He was said to be withdrawn and shy from an early age. His odd situation and fundamentalist religious grandparents made it difficult for him to live a normal childhood. He wasn't allowed to see movies because they were devilish. The only person he was close to was his grandfather. Coming home from the sea, his grandfather's stories were a huge part of Dennis's childhood. But in 1951, Dennis' grandfather had a heart attack at sea and he died.
Okay, so just really adding trauma
Some
to this
trauma,
childhood.
yes. This is a strange thing because they bring the body to the house in a box and it's laid on the dining room table.
Okay.
And instead of the family telling Dennis that his grandfather had died, they simply asked him to come and see Grandad in the dining room.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's a lot to deal with. How old is he at this point? Like,
He's
6
6 years old.
Right, so...
This is his first experience of death and the first time he sees a body.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't see a body at 6 years old. Definitely a bizarre way for this concept to be introduced to a child, I would have thought.
Yeah, with no introduction or, like, explanation of the facts.
No, I mean, I think they implied that he was sleeping.
Long term, that is not a great way to explain death to a child, but I think maybe in the moment...
Or maybe they didn't know how to deal with it
That's
themselves. True. The death made Dennis more reclusive. At the same time, he was coming to terms with the fact that he was experiencing attraction to other boys, and we're in the 50s, so it's not a great time to be able to express that. It's not easy.
Well, especially coming from a very religious, isolated community.
In school, more of the same. He's shy, he doesn't date anyone, obviously. He doesn't have any encounters, but he does get some low-key stalking done of some boys that he likes.
Okay, so there's already some tendencies that are...
There's some stuff going on. Dennis left school at 15, and he joined the army in the catering division. According to him, this was the happiest period in his life. This is a point for me because I find that almost every time I hear about a serial killer's life, they are in some way involved in the army, usually. And I find that so interesting. I wonder what it could be about the army that attracts this kind of person.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
The easy answer is the possibility of permitted violence. But, you know, he's a caterer, so he's not exactly hoping to see combat.
No, he's not directly involved. It's a sort of vicarious experience of violence, if that can contribute to anything.
It could be also that maybe this kind of person craves the structure of the army and maybe thrives in that kind of environment where you have a preoccupation every minute of the day. You know, you're not alone with your thoughts very often.
Yeah, that's true.
Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Jeffrey Dahmer, who was also in the army, but usually they aren't getting a successful career out of it. They're having to leave or get discharged for some reason or another. But Dennis actually had a positive experience there. He spent 11 years travelling. He made friends, although he was never really close to anyone. And he left the army of his own accord in protest against Britain's treatment of the Irish. No arguments from me about that.
No, that's actually
fine.
Pretty decent of him.
After leaving the army, Dennis joined the police force. He was said to enjoy this job, and his workmates actually described him as docile, kind. But if you know anything about serial killers, it's not really surprising that they would describe him that way. These people often appear nice, if a little bit odd, and that's exactly how he appeared. He was considered odd. He was said to have a short temper, but he wasn't disliked. However, his private life was falling away. He had developed a preoccupation with death by this point. In private, he was dressing himself up as a corpse, rubbing talcum powder over himself, and lying in front of mirrors.
Okay, that's... Yeah, I wasn't expecting it to be quite so intense.
The concepts of death and love had become intertwined quite strongly by this point, possibly by the shocking loss of his grandfather. Dennis would later write about his longing to follow his grandpa into the grave as a child, and a deep obsession with the sea, which is obviously where the grandfather died.
Yeah, and I guess it obviously played a big role in his life growing up if they're from a fisherman town.
It said that he had also been sexually excited by still bodies since puberty. So there's that thrown in there. Despite his unconventional private life, Dennis apparently did have a long-term relationship with a man named David, who he met in 1975. They moved into 195 Melrose Avenue together.
So he's moved to London?
Yeah. And they obtained a dog and a cat together. So, sounds normal. This relationship lasted 2 years.
Well, it sounds nice and domestic, but I have a feeling that that's not entirely the case.
No, they didn't stay together for longer than that. Dennis began working as a civil servant for the Department of Employment, which essentially meant he worked at job centres. And if you're not from the UK, a job centre, all one word, is where unemployed people go to get help finding work when they need to go to sign on for unemployment money, do what they need to do to collect that. Dennis worked this type of job until 1983 when he was arrested, so that was his career.
It's interesting that despite being quite reserved as a child and quite antisocial, that he's had so far careers that involve being in contact with other people.
Yeah, quite strongly. If you're working at a job centre, your job is to support people directly. You usually have one-on-one sort of sessions with people to help them. I mean, that's in an ideal world. I don't know how they really... I've never been to a job centre.
I mean, this was also some time ago. Things might have been different. Neither of us are experts on job centres or job centres in the 70s. So...
On New Year's Eve, 1979, Dennis Nilsen brought home an Irish teenager named Stephen Dean Holmes. They had met in the Cricklewood Arms pub, and Nilsen had invited Stephen back to Melrose Avenue to drink.
So, what's the age difference at this point? Like, how old is Nelson?
This kid was 14 years old.
Okay, yeah.
I have to point out that Dennis claimed that he believed that Stephen was 17. Technically, that's not really that much better. But it's over the age of consent in the UK, just to say that. But it was a child, very much. 14 is very young to be going back to grown men's houses. So in 1979, if Dennis Nilsen was born in 45, how old would he be?
So he's 34?
34, so Dennis is 34.
So 20 years older than this boy.
Yeah, and it is a boy, it's, got to point that out. They got drunk, they went to bed together, but according to Dennis, didn't have sex.
So...
That's, we just have to take his word on that.
Right.
Dennis woke up before the boy on New Year's Day, and he was afraid that the boy would leave him. Again, this is conjuring Jeffrey Dahmer for me, because both of these killers sort of crave intimacy, but not from someone who has the option to leave.
Yeah, there's definitely some kind of extreme desire to be with another person, not even sexually, just...
Yeah, it is. In some ways, it isn't sexual. It's true. It's sort of like just an intense desire to possess this person. Dennis is said to have remarked years later that he, as in Stephen, was going to stay with me over the new year, whether he wanted to or not.
So we're well past any form of consent.
Dennis jumps on top of Stephen and strangles him with a necktie into unconsciousness. Dennis then went into the kitchen, got a bucket of water, and drowned the boy in the water. The drowning thing, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Just
That's a good point.
A little bit of a connection there. He then masturbated over the body, supposedly.
Jesus.
Supposedly twice. And I think these details that you get in confessions, because this is obviously where this comes from, are crazy, because when you've got to the point where you're describing the many murders you've committed, obviously the detectives want as many details in the confession as possible, but as an ordinary person you just think, why did that come, why does it matter if it was once or twice or 10 times?
Yeah, at this stage it's not It doesn't make any difference.
Like you say what you did, but to go to the level of saying, oh, it was 3 times. It's like, why? I guess maybe each one is a charge of desecration of a corpse. Maybe so. Maybe something else they could get him.
Maybe
on.
maybe they had to have that information.
I just wonder because it just seems so specific.
But that's another thing about a lot of serial killers is it's sort of bragging about all these sort of things that they've done. They like people to know in extreme detail.
Dennis definitely liked to discuss what he'd done when he was caught. He didn't have any bones about talking about bones. He didn't have any any reservations talking about any of this stuff once he'd been caught. So that is a point. Anyway, he put poor Stephen's body under the floorboards, where it remained for 8 months before he built a bonfire in the garden of his flat and burned the body on the 11th of August 1979. It is absolutely insane to me that you could get away with that once. I've heard so much about the smell of like burning flesh that it's so specific and that it's so disturbing to anyone, that something is wrong when you smell it. So I can't believe that he wouldn't be noticed.
I don't know, I guess this is like London and people are just like, yep, I'm going to mind my own business, not really question anything. But still, it is kind of amazing that, no one thought that this was strange in any way.
On the 3rd of December of that year, 1979, Dennis met a 23-year-old Canadian student called Kenneth Ockenden. He offered to take him sightseeing around London because he was a tourist. This one, for some reason, I find this especially sad to imagine because it really speaks to the innocence of these people, the trust that they would place thoughtlessly in Dennis, while he knew the whole time what he was planning to do.
Yeah, it's horrible.
They go sightseeing around London, and they then go back to Dennis's flat to drink, and Kenneth is then strangled with the cord of some headphones. Dennis said that after killing Kenneth, he then listened to music on the same set of headphones after pouring himself some rum and calming down his dog, who was barking during the attack.
So he's got the animals the whole time.
Yeah, it's said that throughout Dennis's teenage years, he developed a affinity with animals, and he was very much felt connected to animals. And this dog that he had was called Bleep.
Bleep?
Bleep.
Aw.
It was a collie, and a very nice dog. Nice-looking dog, I'd say. I say nice like I know it. All dogs are nice, so I do know that for a fact that Bleep was nice, but...
But so he didn't have any sort of... There wasn't a phase where he was sort of mutilating animals or...
No, that's what's really interesting, because normally you do hear something like that serial killers move from animals to humans, but it seems like Dennis Nilsen loved animals, and that he thought they were worthy of clearly more respect than his victims were. The next day, Dennis bought a Polaroid camera, and he took photos of the body of Kenneth posed suggestively. He then watched television with the body laying beside him.
Okay, so this again is coming back to just having company.
Companionship. Yes, company. I say that with a tone of like sympathy. I don't want to suggest that I have like that I think this is like cute or anything. But he kept Kenneth's body in an armchair next to him, would then undress it and lay it under the floorboards for the night. Kind of like a doll that you're...
I mean...
It's bizarre.
That has to be a lot of work to lift the floorboards every night to store this body.
He's got to be heavy, right? This is a young man, 23, but a grown man at 23, so not easy to conceal, and you'd think he'd be thumping around and the neighbours, I don't know.
But also he's not like preserved in any way, so presumably he's decomposing and being moved around at this time. So
yeah, for 2 weeks he's sort of living with Dennis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so quite a gruesome image.
This one was actually on the news. So this missing student. So Dennis thought that he would be caught for this one. He'd been like sightseeing with Kenneth. He thought people would definitely have seen him in Trafalgar Square with Kenneth, but no one came knocking Dennis's door. Nobody came looking for Dennis.
Yeah. I guess you sort of blend into a crowd at that point if no one's like actively looking for you at the time.
So after this success, to call it that, the killings became more frequent. 10 people died in very similar ways at the flat for the next 20 months. So that's as many as 2 victims a month.
That's a lot. Like, he's really getting into this now, being very active.
People seemed to be able to go to Dennis's flat and disappear without anyone missing them. But many people who casually went there did leave unharmed. He didn't kill everyone that he brought back, and probably that helped.
So do we know if he's like specifically targeting people who won't be missed, or is it just completely random?
I think based on the people that were killed, that we'll go into in a minute, that he would only kill, I think, he wasn't stupid. He would only kill when I think he thought no one's coming looking for this person. And Kenneth is kind of an exception to that, because Kenneth was the one who was missed, and lots of these men and boys sadly weren't missed at all.
Mm.
Dennis says of the start of his killing career that I had started down the avenue of death and possession of a new kind of flatmate.
Okay, that's yeah, I'm not liking his perspective on this whole...
Sums it up, really.
Yeah.
He would lure young men, some of them just boys really, back to Melrose Avenue, either for sex or alcohol or a place to stay, where he would then attempt to strangle them. Many of these men and boys were vulnerable. Many of them were homeless. Lots of them were looking for shelter, and some of them were looking for comfort. There is talk of how this case sort of sheds a light on the issues of the late 70s and early 80s in London. There was rising vagrancy among teens at that time. Many of these teens were leaving the care system. They were being encouraged to take up sex work at a young age. And it was extremely easy for these vulnerable people to disappear and no one to be looking for them, like we've just mentioned.
It's so tragic, though.
It's incredibly tragic, and Dennis Nilsen exploited this with many of his victims. There were a number of people who were attacked by Dennis, though, who actually escaped over the years, but these attacks never led to any charges. A student from Hong Kong named Andrew was attacked but managed to escape the flat.
I mean, it's interesting that no one would press charges or go to the police.
That has a lot to do with being gay in that time and being judged by the police for, going home to a stranger's flat.
Well, I mean, it is illegal at this point, isn't it? When was it legalized?
It's so unbelievable when you get onto that topic. I can't believe that it was so recently legalized, but I think it was the late 60s / early 70s, so even if it is legal, it's still very much taboo in the eyes of most people. I think that has a lot to do with not reporting the crimes.
Yeah, I guess they sort of assume that the police won't really help them anyway. Because of this whole taboo nature of being in another man's apartment.
Yes. In total, Dennis said he had tried and failed to kill 7 people. And that's, when you compare that to having 12 confirmed murders, that's quite a surprisingly high failure rate.
Yeah, he's not great at this.
So seven people that you tried to kill and you failed to kill them, and 12 people that you do kill. I mean, that's just seems like it's almost 50-50 whether you're going to get one or not.
And it still took this, so long for him to actually be caught, despite this.
He does, obviously, unfortunately, succeed in taking the lives of at least 12 people. The method of killing was almost always strangulation, often with a tie, mostly after the victim had been... There's a lot of strength that has to go into that. Dennis did do, obviously, even though he was a caterer, he did have the sort of standard army training, so he was...
Yeah, and presumably
he was combat trained.
He had quite a physical upbringing, I guess, if you're in that sort of harsh rural life. I mean, it seems strange to me that he's still using a tie. Like, he hasn't decided to get some more quote-unquote professional equipment.
Yeah, it makes you think that even as he's getting into it and he's killing more and more people, it's still a crime that's impulsive. It's still like, I don't know whether I'm going to kill someone until they're here. And until, like, I've spoken to them and I've made sure...
Yeah, as you said before, if they're... I mean, he let people go as well. So he really hasn't... I mean, it's obviously premeditated, but it's not... I don't know, he hasn't really thought it through entirely.
Sometimes the killing was finalised by drowning, with the bucket, as in the first case.
Right.
Let's talk some more about the other victims that are known. Martin Duffy had been in care and at school for maladjusted boys. He was a drifter. He hitchhiked and slept in stations. He was only 16 when he met Dennis Nilsen. It was days before his birthday, his 17th birthday. Martin had attempted to study catering, so that probably gave them something in common, Dennis being a caterer. So they went back to Dennis' flat together. Dennis killed Martin by strangulation and drowning, and this is what he had to say afterwards. I then lifted him into my arms and took him into the room. I laid him on the floor and took off his socks, jeans, shirt and underpants. I don't know why he doesn't just say took off his clothes.
Again, it's like the details that he likes to sort of bring up, I guess.
I carried him into the bathroom. I got into the bath myself and he lay in the water on top of me. He lay like he's got a choice.
Yeah, it sort of makes it sound like he's got some agency, which he clearly doesn't.
I washed his body, both of us dripping wet. I somehow managed to hoist this slipping burden onto my shoulders and took him to the room. I sat him on the kitchen chair and dried us both. I put him on the bed. He was still very warm. I talked to him and mentioned that his body was the youngest looking I have ever seen. I kissed him all over and held him close to me. I sat on his stomach and masturbated. I kept him in the cupboard. 2 days later, I found him bloated in the cupboard. He went straight under the floorboards.
I guess the water had a sort of effect on him then. If the others hadn't been bloated.
I mean, don't they bloat anyway? But yeah, it is interesting that he's surprised.
Yeah.
So maybe it did have an effect. Billy Sutherland, 27, was a prisoner. I mean, not at the time, and a sex worker. He was one of the few, like Kenneth Ockenden, to be reported missing, though it wasn't as big of a deal. Dennis barely remembered this victim.
It's interesting that he wouldn't remember it.
He says later that there are some that he just doesn't have any memory of, and that's funny for someone who wants to go into a lot of detail.
Yeah.
Malcolm Barlow, 24, an epileptic man who had many behavioural difficulties, roamed around in hostels all over the country. On 17th September 1981, he was strangled by Dennis, mainly for being a nuisance, as he had passed out from taking pills. Barlow was the last person to die at Melrose Avenue. There were other victims who preceded Malcolm, and were never identified. At the end of 1980, Dennis had 6 bodies either stored under the floorboards or dissected and placed in his garden shed in suitcases. When it came to disposing of these bodies, he would remove the organs, place them on the ground between 2 fences at the side of his garden, and within a couple of days they would be consumed by animals. So that's easy.
Oh, that's practical.
Which, yeah, it's not only horrifying, but it's something that I would literally never imagine I could get away with yet again. It's just bizarre how basic and open these methods are. He's just going to put the organs out in his garden and wait for animals to eat them. But I guess maybe people, if they did see it, might mistake it for animal offal.
But again, do you think there's a possibility that he wanted to be caught? I mean, he's not really being careful.
That is something that we'll probably touch on again later, because there's definitely a lot of suspicion that he did want to be caught, or subconsciously wanted to be caught.
Or maybe he's just very bold. I mean, like, once he realised that no one was going to find... I mean, he had that moment of panic with the second victim, that someone was going to identify him, and once no one did, maybe he just thought that he was above the law.
When serial killers seem so brash, like, so unconcerned over whether they get caught, there's always a debate over whether they subconsciously really want to get caught, or whether their opinion of themselves just gets higher and higher and they think there's no way I can get caught, I'm a god, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there are different schools of thought on that, but it's got to be different for each person.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously we're talking about individuals who are deranged in some way or another. What we perceive as just being completely bizarre behaviour they don't even realise what they're doing to a certain extent.
In December 1980, Dennis had another bonfire, and he burned the corpses all together with a tire on top of the fire to disguise the smell. Get this. It was said that the fire burned all day and that local children gathered to watch it.
Oh my god, that's just
Can you
horrific.
Imagine? Can you imagine knowing? And then later finding out what you were looking at and you didn't even notice?
I mean, if you're not looking for it, maybe you just don't notice.
Yeah. So Dennis moved out of Melrose Avenue. He moved into 23 Cranley Gardens, Muswell Hill, at the end of 1981. He waited a while before resuming killing in 1982. He entertained people that he met at his new home without incident, and even said things like, "I was elated, nothing went wrong." So it seemed like, it was like every time he took someone into his home, he was like pleasantly surprised that they left and he didn't kill them. It's like he felt like this disconnect between Dennis and, whatever Dennis was doing.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, when he sort of talks about his victims as sort of almost being alive after being murdered, he obviously has some kind of disconnect.
His connection between death and love in his mind is like giving him the impression that he's almost giving them a gift.
And having the privilege of being his companion, almost.
The first person to die at Cranley Gardens was John Howlett, 23. John, like most others, met Dennis in a pub and he was strangled. Reportedly, as Dennis shouted, "It's about time you went."
Okay, so there's just more and more elements.
You were getting a little bit more deranged as it's going. I mean, it was deranged to kill one person, obviously, but we're getting to this sort of
delusional vision of things.
According to Dennis, this was a difficult murder because John put up a fight and he needed to be drowned as well. His body was dismembered, portions of his flesh and organs were flushed down the toilet, and his larger bones were, and I'm going to put my incredulous voice back on again here, his bones were put out with the rubbish.
Makes sense.
I mean, I get that they're definitely going to be in a bag, right? But it's like, they're right there,
Yeah.
Like, this is the luckiest guy in the country.
I mean, yeah, really. I can't believe that he's getting away with this for so long.
And again, like I've written in my notes, it makes you wonder about the desire to be caught, which you already brought up, which we'll get into again in a bit. Graham Allen, 27. Graham met Dennis in Shaftesbury Avenue, up near the theatres, as he was hailing a taxi. Graham was strangled while eating an omelette cooked for him by Dennis. Pieces of his dissected body were also flushed down the toilet at Cranley Gardens. Dennis's final victim was Stephen Sinclair, 20 years old. Stephen was originally an Australian. He was already Australian. He was a heroin addict, sadly. Dennis brought Stephen a hamburger before luring him back to the flat, where Stephen would drink, inject heroin, and then be strangled to death by Dennis Nilsen. The head, upper torso, and arms were said to be stored in a tea chest in Dennis' living room, and the legs and lower torso under the bath.
But so he's not bothered by this guy taking heroin, but the victim who had taken pills was considered a nuisance.
I guess that depends what kind of pills you take, because not that I know too much about this subject, but could the pills that the other guy took be sort of uppers? You know, could he have been being annoying, talking a lot, you know, that kind of thing, whereas heroin, as far as I know, is the opposite of that.
Yeah. Also, I mean, I guess we shouldn't be trying to find any sort of rational or logical explanation.
There's no possible room to blame the victim in any of these scenarios for taking drugs or for anything they were doing. They had problems, for sure, every single one of them, and they deserve sympathy. I don't think any of them deserve death for their behaviour.
No, I mean, as you said before, these are vulnerable people that he's taking advantage of.
Extremely, yeah. Before killing Stephen, Dennis claimed he sent his dog Bleep out of the room, and he has said, "Looking back, I think she knew what was about to happen, even had become resigned to it. This was something I had to do. All that beauty, all that potential, and all the pain that is life. I have to stop it. I did not feel bad. I did not feel evil."
Okay.
It turned out that, shockingly, all of the flushing of flesh down the drain had caused issues with the plumbing at Cranley Gardens.
Oh, yeah, colour me shocked.
Dino Rod Plumbing sent a guy round who tracked the issue to a part of the sewer outside of the house. He accessed it via the manhole cover and discovered... I'm not going to give it a crazily in-depth description, but essentially a disgusting substance accompanied by a rank smell.
Oh god, this poor guy was just doing his job.
It's an early morning call, he gets this. He told tenants he would be returning the following day to investigate with his boss. When he returned the next day, the sludge was gone, and he noticed the manhole had been disturbed since he had used it the previous day. However, digging in a pipe with his hands, he found some more pieces of the stuff and some small bones. Tenants told the plumbers that they thought the man who lived in the attic flat, Dennis Nilsen, had entered the manhole. So the police were called and the flesh and bones were sent for testing. Meanwhile, they began investigating the man in the attic flat. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. soon discovered the man's identity. Dennis Andrew Nilsen, an executive officer at the job centre in Kentish Town.
So he's been just climbing that ladder.
He's been climbing that ladder, yes. He lived alone in the flat with a dog named Bleep and was known to rarely have contact with the other tenants. After forensics confirmed that the remains found in the drain were human, DCIJ and 2 police inspectors paid a visit to Dennis. When they told him the remains were human, Dennis exclaimed, "Good grief, how awful." After which...
I guess we don't have any sort of indication on the tone or how convincing this was.
Obviously, they weren't convinced by this because DCIJ asked Dennis, "Where's the rest of the body?" And Dennis reportedly answered, "In 2 plastic bags in the wardrobe. Come on, I'll show you."
Oh, so he just caved immediately.
So it was instant. There was
which again comes back to this whole thing of wanting people to sort of know.
He did, I think, later say he was relieved to have been caught. The smell in the flat was said to be overpoweringly awful. One of the policemen asked, "Are we talking about 1 body or 2? To which Dennis is said to have replied, 15 or 16 since 1978.
Oh, so he's really been keeping track of this. Like, there is some kind of... It's just not totally impulsive.
It's amazing, though. 15 or 16. How do you not know the answer to that? Like, how do you not know that for certain? Killing someone, even if you do it more than 5 times, it should be incredibly memorable.
But then, so if the smell is unbearable, and also, I assume, since I have no personal experience, but dismembering bodies makes noise. And none of the neighbours have reported this, like, before this whole event.
He's incredibly lucky. The same evening, Dennis' flat was searched, and the search revealed various dissected human body parts and offal belonging to 3 separate individuals in plastic bags, including 2 human heads, one of them with all the flesh boiled away, and the other partially so.
He's escalated to, like, boiling them.
So I think he kept heads for quite a while. I don't know if there was some other sort of thrill to it, but also I imagine they're probably the hardest thing to get rid of. I mean, a head's a head.
Yeah.
So I think that's why he would boil them. I don't know about cannibalism. I don't think he ever ate any of them like, say, Jeffrey Dahmer did.
But could it also be that he likes keeping a souvenir of his victims?
Yeah, maybe he can't keep the whole body for the reasons, of convenience, but the heads may be easier to keep. The second head belonged to Stephen Sinclair, Dennis' final victim, and some of the body parts belonged to John Howlett, the first victim at Cranley Gardens. Sadly, the third victim was never identified, and if anything makes ghosts in a place, it's being an unidentified unknown murder victim.
There's definitely some poltergeist action going on there.
On the 11th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen took police to 195 Melrose Avenue and pointed out areas of the garden where he suggested they might find human remains. Amazingly, they did, and they found enough to identify 8 different people.
Really sad that a lot of these people weren't identified. Or I don't know how many, but any unidentified murder victim is tragic.
That day, the 11th of February 1983, Dennis was charged with Stephen Sinclair's murder. It's said that Dennis, quote, would not stop talking once he was arrested. He was extremely cooperative, and he talked at length about his crimes. This allowed police to track down one of the victims who escaped. This was a man called Carl Stotter, who had been strangled and drowned into unconsciousness, but then revived by Dennis over the next day and a half and allowed to leave. Eventually, Dennis would be charged with 6 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and he was held in Brixton Prison. When his solicitor Ronald Moss asked him why he had done it, Dennis is said to have replied, "I am hoping you will tell me that." The only reason this went to trial, because obviously you would imagine someone would just be like, yeah, I'm guilty. I mean, you've seen all the stuff, so...
He's confessed.
Yeah, it sounds like he would plead guilty, but it was a matter of verdict and sentencing, not whether the crimes had been committed, but what the technicalities were, because obviously Dennis Nilsen's legal team would naturally argue the only argument they could in the face of the evidence, which is that he was so mentally impaired that his murders needed to be downgraded to manslaughter.
Okay.
Looked like you rolled your eyes there a little bit. This is known as diminished responsibility in the UK. I know that in America it's known as not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution actually agreed that Dennis was abnormal mentally, but they maintained that it wasn't substantial to the point where he didn't know what he was doing. The prosecution spared the jury the photographs from inside Dennis Nilsen's flat, and they also conceded in advance that they wouldn't use homosexuality against the defendant, which, I mean, wow, big of them.
That's so generous.
Just as, like, a nice thing that we'll do, we won't use you being gay against you. It's like, Jesus Christ. The witnesses, surviving victims, Carl Stotter and Paul Nobbs. Paul Nobbs had a similar story to Carl. He had been partially strangled while asleep at Dennis's flat after the two had spent the day together, but he didn't realise this until he went to the hospital on Dennis's advice the next day, complaining of soreness, sickness, and burst blood vessels in his eyes. And then they told him, well, your symptoms are from partial strangulation.
God, that must be... I mean, I can't imagine just thinking, oh, I've got a bit of a sore throat, and then someone's explaining, no, someone has tried to strangle you.
So, on the lack of sympathy from police due to attitudes to homosexuality, this is another reason that I think Dennis could get away with what he did. And I realise I'm bringing up Jeffrey Dahmer again, but there's a lot of parallels because in one case, a victim of Jeffrey Dahmer's was found wandering around, bleeding, disorientated, and long story short, he was released back to Jeffrey Dahmer by police officers.
They brought him back to him.
Yeah, because they basically just didn't want to get involved. They didn't have an understanding of gay relationships, probably didn't care to. This was despite the protests of the two women who had found the victim wandering around. They said, something isn't right about this situation, and the police were like, whatever. That boy was later killed. So it just goes to show how dangerous it can be to dismiss things based on your lack of understanding.
Definitely.
The victim's relationship to society in these cases is preventing them from being helped, from asking for help, and the public opinion seems to be like, well, yeah, these are bizarre underground relationships, so what do we care?
Yeah, well, especially, I mean, a lot of these victims, as we said before, are sort of vulnerable, they don't have families, so that sort of adds to the whole general opinion of people not wanting to get involved.
While he was in Brixton prison, Dennis wrote, "The train of words digestion and answers from my head cannot give the answer or hope to raise the dead. Everyone wants labels pinned neatly on my skin, a comfortable judgment, casting their stones at sin. Foaming Tory ladies, rule Britannia's sung. Nilsen is a monster, should be bloody hung. Screaming mobs aplenty, never knew Sinclair, wouldn't give him gutter room, here or anywhere." Sinclair obviously being his last victim, Stephen Sinclair.
Yeah.
So what he's basically saying is, you didn't give a shit about them while they were alive. Now suddenly you care about them. And to be honest, he's right. I mean, it's odd to hear it from him, but he's pointing out something that is interesting.
Still doesn't excuse the murder. But,
no, of course not. But it is interesting, that he's got that perspective on it. You didn't care about them. Now suddenly you care about them.
Yeah, he's very aware, actually.
Very, very aware. After a 2-week trial and 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Dennis Nilsen guilty on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment of no less than 25 years. He was imprisoned at Wormwood Scrubs, then he was moved to the Isle of Wight, to Parkhurst Prison, and then to Wakefield Prison, where he remained until he died. Dennis was a union man, so he was said to have been quite unpopular with the prison system due to being quick to call out and report any infractions of rules by prison staff. He was constantly complaining about his rights being violated. He was quite popular with the other inmates because he would cause trouble for the system, and obviously they were all for that. I read a story that he once complained that his human rights were being violated because he was ordering gay pornography magazines into the prison and they were being censored. So stuff was being cut out of the magazines before it was being given to him, and he reported this. He escalated this to a hearing, and they were like, no.
I mean, it raises the question of whose job is it to cut out?
Yeah, it's crazy. He died in prison last May 2018. I did also read I have an article here about the house, which is near me. Far be it from me to promote The Sun, but this article is from The Sun. The headline is "Made a Killing. We bought Dennis Nilsen's murder home where serial killers stashed 12 bodies underfloor and for a cut price." Apparently the first-time buyers Bruno and Mathilde were not put off by its grisly past, and they have transformed it into their dream home, and they plan to start a family there.
Wow.
This article claims he had sex with rotting corpses. I think that might be actually a misconception. I think that he didn't actually have sex with them. Or if he did, he thought it was too horrible for even him to go into, but he obviously had a sexual interest in them, but I don't think that he actually did have full, that's quite a tabloid thing to go into.
Yeah, I guess to sensationalize the whole story.
So, recommended reading for this episode. If you want to find out more about this case, I've started reading the book Killing for Company by Brian Masters, which is an in-depth study of Dennis Nilsen's case from letters exchanged between the author and Dennis in prison. It's amazingly detailed. It's fascinating, actually. It goes into a lot more detail about Dennis's childhood and the culture around him and his life, basically. One of the most interesting things is that, according to Brian Masters, the letter requesting the drains be inspected at Cranley Gardens was in Dennis Nilsen's handwriting.
Okay, so that's really intriguing.
He seemed lazy about covering it up and so easily spoke about the crimes. his motivation, it seems to be almost like lack of motivation. It's like, why don't I just kill people?
Yeah, he's very... I mean, obviously he's going out and finding these people and bringing them back to his place, but he's not a very proactive... He's sort of just passively
It's
killing
like these
almost.
things happen to him, or like these people come into his life and then sometimes they end up dying. You know, it's like...
Yeah, coming back to the whole pleasantly surprised that he hadn't murdered people. He doesn't perceive himself as having control over it.
So I recommend this book if you're interested. That's Killing for Company by Brian Masters. Shout out to my dad's friend Alex for recommending that book, who is a fellow crime buff. That's about it for this case and for this week. We're on social media at About Murder on Twitter, facebook.com/a podcast about murder with no E, because you can't write murder in a Facebook URL. And Instagram at A Podcast About Murder. This time that has an E. The links are in the description box, so please do connect with us there. And if you would like to send us an email about this case, feedback on the episode, or maybe requesting a case for us to look into, please email apodcastaboutmurder@outlook.com. Thanks for joining me and Jem for the first episode of A Podcast About Murder. We hope to see you in A Manner of Speaking next week Friday for another one. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and have a great weekend.
See you next time. In a totally genuine and natural